today's program, we have Beth Hoffman here. Bet the Farm, the Dollars and Cents of Growing Food in America. And let's just do a little bit of background on Beth. Beth has reported on food and agriculture for 25 years, airing on NPR, publishing in The Guardian and Civil Eats, and blogging as The Hungry Hack for Forbes.com. Hoffman now raises grass-finished beef with her husband John on a 570-acre farm in Iowa. Her book, Bet the Farm, is a first-hand account of the perils of the modern American food system and an exploration of more just and sustainable ways of producing food. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
Should we start right off with the questions? Yeah. Okay. We're going to throw some questions at Beth right here. Okay, first one. How did you come up with the idea of the book?
So, well, thank you all for having me. Thanks for coming to this talk. Well, I can move it to it. As was just said, I was reporting on food and agriculture for about 20 years at the time when I moved to San Francisco. I moved to Berkeley, actually, to go to grad school at the Berkeley School of Journalism. And I met my now husband within the first few moments of being at my apartment. He was a neighbor. We shared a back porch. He walked out and he said, I'd just been in Iowa with my kids. I love this farm. I'm going back there when the kids are grown. And at the time, I very honestly probably could not have told you accurately where Iowa was on a map. I hadn't spent any time in the Midwest. I'd grown up on the East Coast. I had lived in Utah for a long time, and then I was on the West Coast. But because I had been reporting on food and agriculture as the kids grew, and as we spent time in Iowa on the farm, I got to know this place, and which is Sac and Fox Meskwaki land, and I started really, developing my own relationship with this land, and it became, it felt like a gift. Like, oh, I've been talking about food and agriculture for all this time. Now maybe I could actually go and do agriculture on this land. My husband had been a farm boy, grew up there, loved it, went to San Francisco to culinary school, was a chef in San Francisco, was a wine buyer, became a butcher for the 12 years before we moved. So combined, we had this enormous amount of information about food and experience. But really what struck me was that, I had reported a lot on sustainability, environmental issues. This farm's doing something interesting here. These people are addressing this over there. But once we got the lease with John's dad, which is a big part of the book, transitioning of land between generations and within families is a huge, huge deal. But once we had this lease, we sat down with my mom, who is a CPA, and it was like time for the business plan. And I remember just like getting crankier and crankier. Like as this conversation was going on, I realized I was like, wait a minute, that's all we're gonna make? Like after we buy the cattle and we maybe have been there for 5 years or 10, like that's it? And it just was this huge wake-up call that I've been reporting on this for a really long time, and how come I didn't understand this at all? And as I started digging into it, it was like, okay, maybe because we want to do different things. We don't want to do commodity agriculture. Maybe that's why. No, that wasn't why. Commodity agriculture isn't working either economically. So it was this huge aha, like, oh, if I don't know this, there's probably a lot of people who don't know this. And so that was the background for the book.
Yeah, for sure. Has anybody had a chance to read the book quite yet? I did. Drove from Rapid this morning and audio, and it kept me intrigued the entire time. So I highly suggest it. Yeah, I made it through chapter 12.
Oh,
So I've
wow.
I know
Yeah.
the juice at the end.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
so excited. So, but it's so. And then I listened to a couple podcasts too. So search Beth Hoffman and check it out because I think it really is the beginning of a movement that needs to happen.
Oh,
So
thank you.
I think that however you came up with the idea, it was a gift for all of us. So where does your story begin? Do you want to go back to your roots?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the story, one of the stories about agriculture in this way really is this whole colonial exploitative system that came. We were a country that was created as a colony to supply commodities for export. That was what we were doing, and brought in slaves. Got rid of people who were already on the land. Just kind of marched ahead in this very exploitative, extractive way, and if you think about like little towns in Italy or something, right, that are known for like a particular cheese or this artisanal way of making ham or something, like that is not what the American system set up. We were like, the first colonies were raising tobacco for export. And as the rail line came across the US and continued to displace people, who came in were people that were following these, like, really this mythology, this dream of like, you can make it big out here. Just come on in and do agriculture, and it will, you will find this American dream, quote unquote. So it's a really interesting idea where, and years before, I had written a report for Oxfam International, which was about the 10 biggest food and beverage companies and their participation in hunger and poverty around the world. So, and it was really, we made it with that framing too. It was just, so it really set this book up for me to think about things in that way, and how the commodity system, that's what it's set up to do. To create the most cheap food that's possible. Most of it, a lot of it for export still. So getting out of the system, and in the book, it's a lot about trying to do something different. It's a really difficult task. So I'm sure we'll talk more about it.
Approaching it differently, yes, for sure. And like here it says, where does your story begin? But I think it also find it interesting that you grew up outside of a major city. Your husband grew up in rural America, and that through your work kind of had, like you said, led you to this as being a gift. So now you show up there, you've done a lot of other reporting, but why write another book about farming?
Yeah, I really felt like once I was here, one of the very savvy things my husband did early on is I was a radio reporter, so I had all this like radio equipment, and so on one of the first trips that we did out to the farm, he said, well, why don't you bring your equipment and interview my parents? It was something I would do for people, like it was a side job, like people could hire me to interview their parents, and I'd make a CD of it. So I came out and I interviewed his parents, which very quickly gave me this view not only into the family, but this whole world of agriculture that I think a lot of journalists on the coast kind of ignore, right? It's like this commodity, big agriculture in the middle of our country. We kind of act like it doesn't really exist. Or worse, talk about farmers as if they're brainwashed by agribusiness, they're uneducated, they're just, and so as I was talking to John's dad, as I went around and I interviewed a lot of farmers around the farm, a lot of the old timers, it just became really clear to me that they had made the decisions that they made for good reasons. They weren't just like falling in line and doing as they're told, as some of the story kind of sounds. I'm going to back up so you can see as well. And I just felt like there was this, gap in the literature, so to speak, of there not being anything that was really empathetic about farmers and farming. It was all kind of given this lens of just that farming is about these huge environmental impacts, which it is also. But I just became really passionate about the idea of if we want to make change, we have to understand why people are doing what they do. You can't just say from the outside, like, oh, change this, no more water pollution, we need better nutrition. It's like we have to actually address farm level issues. So I felt like it wasn't just going to be another kind of doom and gloom look at all the terrible things that farming was doing to this country and to the land, but a real analysis of like why do we do, why does my father-in-law plant GMO seeds, and why is he, so a much more empathetic look.
Well, and like I said, I still have a couple of chapters left, but I was able at least to get to the point where at the end, you're like, I have some ideas. Here are some solutions. And that's how I think it can be different from a lot of other books, is you just talk about problems, but where are the solutions? And so I'm excited to get to the rest of those.
Yeah, and it's a difficult, it was really pitched to the publishers first, like, oh, I talk about all these problems, and then the second half, it's going to be solutions. And then I started thinking about it and kind of not wanting to go down the road of, again, like, here's a farm doing something interesting, maybe we can scale it up, and here's somebody else doing, because it's so contextual, all the different kinds of agriculture and what people are doing and how it fits into their particular locale and their community. It just is. So what I ended up doing is really looking at solutions through and trying to suggest different ways of looking at the problems, and also thinking about it from the self. Like, farmers have a lot of work to do on their own, right? And how to address stress, how to address the lack of options out there. So the self, the farms working together, and then policy in a national and international lens. So, yeah, hopefully I've given people things to think about anyway in those kinds of ways. It's not as specific, because there is no silver bullet. It's not just like, oh, we changed the subsidy system and everything will be good. No.
Well, and I think there, as you get into, generations of farming, I mean, you're dealing with a lot more than just changing a few things. I mean, you're talking to the foundation of why people are there.
Yes.
Which you went into as well, talking about the sensationalism of that culture, of that lifestyle. So you also, because it was, these generations a long time ago, Charles Ingalls, like you said, I was just there at the Laura Ingalls Wilder a couple weeks ago, and it's just all these promises. And so then you have a family that begins that generations ago, and you can't let go of that idea.
Yeah,
So
I
if you
kind
wanna
of
get into
tackle
that.
like two big myths throughout the book, and have asked readers to really question them. The one that she's referring to is this agrarian myth that the Laura Ingalls Wilder books really participated in that, sort of building up this whole, the quaintness of it, the beauty of having your hands in the dirt. Now there's like a whole nother world of that, right? Of like homesteading, and you're just going to get back to the land and it's going to be great. And as things have gone on too with that, now we also see that kind of sustainable, alternative agriculture world, I'll call it, because some of it's more sustainable than others. But, if you're growing fruits and vegetables and you have chickens, and even if you're feeding the community with it, there's these really huge, if you think about it, huge kinds of things that kind of farming is supposed to address at this point. Like, we're supposed to save the planet now. right? We're the solution to climate change. We're supposed to, improve the health of our communities and nourish our communities. These are huge. I can't think of another profession that's supposed to take on that kind of responsibility. And what that mythology does is you see it all the time, right? You see The Biggest Little Farm, for example, that movie. Or that Joel Salatin is a person who's written a lot of books. There's a lot of attention about it. And those sorts of ways of farming, they look really picturesque and quaint and sweet. And then you have to realize those people are expected to do 1,000 things. Like to have that Biggest Little Farm, perfect farm thing happen, they have to have every sort of animal that's taking care of the other. Like you're building an entire ecosystem that's supposed to have then, Mother Nature's going to kick in and take care of the weeds and the bugs and your soil's healthy. And those people tend to farm like maybe max 5 years because you cannot sustain that. You cannot sustain that sort of energy in farming and the money. Like The Biggest Little Farm. Who's seen that movie? I'm going to refer to it. Okay, you should watch this movie because it's beautiful. And they also put into that farm probably easily $5 million, right? It's like, and they never mention the money. So it's one of those things like throughout the book I'm saying that's perfect, but, right, like where's all this money coming from, this investment?
So we're never quite getting the reality from a lot of media sources. And so now when you have the generation take over, it's a very different story.
Yeah.
Tell us about the farm today, now that you and your husband took it over. Where is it and what are you growing?
Yeah, it's South Central Iowa. So John's dad was growing conventional corn, soybeans, cattle. We decided, environmentally speaking, that's not what we wanted to do, and we knew that. So we took out all the row cropping. We planted, so it's 530 acres. It's quite a piece of land. And we planted it all with hay and pasture. We bought the cattle from John's dad, but we went from conventional cattle world to a grass finishing them on the land. So that means that instead of, the normal cow-calf operation is what it's called, is when you drive around, you see cattle everywhere. What's happening there is that the mama cows are having calves, and then at around 9 months, they're weaned, and they go, usually, at this point, really, there's maybe 1 or 2 buyers that are left, and so they go into those feedlots. They're sold off to these bigger conglomerates that control the whole system. So we now keep them on the land. They take anywhere from about 20 to 30 months to come to weight on pasture. And so we direct market it. So that means we have to figure out all the marketing, all of where's the customers, how do we get them there, the locker, which over COVID, there's some chapters in there where I talk about just this whole process of learning how far out you had to actually book appointments at the slaughterhouse. We found a locker now, so now we have this rhythm of it. But it was like a year and a half that these places were having you have to have made an appointment. And I mean, that's almost the entirety of the animal's life. How would I know, exactly how many animals? So it was crazy. And we also raise goats. So we now have about 35 goats, Kikos, that are meat goats. We have not sold our first batch of them yet, but there is a very large market for goat out there. It's really just white Americans are the only people in the world who don't eat goat. And so there's apparently like a very large market for them. And they also clean brush. So they are like, we call them our herd of locusts. We put them in areas and they just clean all the invasive species, the multiflora rose, the honeysuckle, they just devour it. So it's been good. We have been selling all our cattle. We've had really good reports about the flavor of it, because that's a big deal with grass finishing beef. A lot of people really like corn finished beef because it's fattier, but it's been very tasty. And we now, right now though, are having a very hard time. We're having our calves are now being born in the fall. And we actually have lost a bunch of calves, we think, to the heat and forage issues with the nutrient density of our forage because of the intense heat and drought in the area. So that has not been fun.
Yeah, constantly working with the weather.
Yeah.
Which is constantly
which is farming.
changing. Yes.
You're not in control.
Yeah. And how do you deal with that?
Yeah.
Relinquishing control,
Yeah.
especially if you've been grown up in situations or worked in situations where you could maintain that, but no longer.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing, right? I've written after the book. This isn't really in the book so much, but as city people, like, we think we're in control of everything. It's a really interesting thing, right? We we keep everything tidy, our lawns, we have, we spray things. If it's, there's a bug, no, I don't like bugs, we spray that, and we have this illusion, really, that we're, like, completely in control. It's hot out, but everything's air conditioned, it's cold out, everything, it's like we're comfortable, and then that was a really, really interesting part of being a farmer, was just this whole it's not going to go as I want. I'm not in control. There's the weather, there's the markets, there's, and even we've lost 6 calves. Having to be there to help the moms, one of them almost died in the process of giving birth. It's just, I'm sure there's lots of other professions, my friends who are, doctors, maybe it's you see life and death, but it's a whole different experience. And again, it's really a gift to be given that, knowledge at 54, I'm not in control. Really? So it's been fascinating.
Have you been able to apply that to other parts of your life then?
Well, yeah, as part of this and part of the book, it's like this learning to deal with stress. And I think farmer stress is one of those topics that's just gotten, the past decade, the prices of commodities have been terrible. It's just gotten good in the last year or two. And it will be terrible again. And that's the other part of it. It's prices go up, but they just spike and come back down. You look at anything, wheat, corn, beans, it goes, it'll go plateau, up, down, plateau, and when it goes up, and if you looked at the price of fertilizer or seed, it's going right up with it, right? So, so stress is such an important part of learning to manage stress. And maybe, I really had to learn how to, well, let me just say, with the stress on top of this agrarian myth of pick yourself up by your bootstraps and the rugged individual, I'm just out here. And so you start to perceive it's it's just me, I'm not doing this right. And that's just toxic, in any part of our lives, to just feel alone and you can't ask for help. And I think that's something that farmers really, there's more and more services to help, because farmer suicides have been increasing, in the past several years. And I'd encourage people, to find community, to find help, to find resources, because we're not alone. And things like the Practical Farmers of Iowa, not sure what you all have here, but it's really a lifesaver to be able to get together with other farmers and to have networks and listservs, and so we can put out on the listserv, hey, we're losing calves, what's going on here? Does anybody have any suggestions? And the number of responses that we got that said something like, I don't know anything about calving. I don't know how to help you, but wow, if you need anything, let us know. Like our hearts are going out to you. Like we feel we know what this pain would be like, even if I grow flowers, you know. It's just, it's so comforting to have that and to know, okay, it's not us. We're not doing everything wrong, and this isn't a big sign we shouldn't be farmers or, you know.
Well, when you mentioned that, I thought, well, it was interesting because as farms get bigger, where within a certain acreage area you might have 10 families and now you might only have 2 families, and so you do miss that camaraderie of community being
can't
close
imagine.
by. But I suppose we live in a day and age where we can get on the
Yeah,
server, you know, places
yeah.
like that's where we can connect in different ways. which
Yes,
is
but I
helpful too,
don't
but it's not the
know.
same.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's
I
not
mean,
the
I don't know. I just, the isolation must be
Yeah.
pretty intense, you know, to be in that situation where you're farming 10,000 acres and you're kind of by yourself in that, you know, in the cab.
Yeah.
I kind of can't imagine. I mean, writing is sort of a similar situation, right? Where you're just at home doing your thing and, you know, but, yeah.
When you described farming in that way of you make up your days and no one's telling you what to do, I thought of, well, writing is similar, so, but it's not the same between being a writer and a farmer, obviously.
Yeah,
You're
yeah,
used
everything.
to that solitary mindset, but in a different context. And
Yeah,
you
but I
hadn't
think
done
it's like if
before.
you look at it in the context too of when you're farming, it's usually rural communities and you're watching the decline of your community and the storefronts are empty and, you know, it's not that uplifting, right? It's not an environment where you're just like, you know.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that these things are all intertwined, and it's not like, you know, the book isn't, and I hope you're not like, oh no, I would never read that. That's so depressing.
Oh, it's not.
But you know, the idea is like we can change these things. You know, we just, you know, humans have the ability to change our ways. We don't have to just keep heading in the same direction where farms are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the towns are just gone. You know, a great example of this is we visited this farm. It's in southern Georgia. It's called White Oak Pastures, and it's a family that's gotten a lot of notoriety for being kind of on the forefront of regenerative agriculture. It's Will Harris is the guy who's the patriarch of this family, and he's been doing this for like 30 years now. He's and he's not adverse to risk at all. So he's just risked it all in this farm and just put his you know, heart and soul into this. And we were there, and there's just a million things going on this farm. So back to my point of like doing too much. Well, they've added it over time. They've added people to manage these different parts of the farm. And so we were there it felt really overwhelming initially. We're like, we could never accomplish this all. I mean, we're in our 50s. I don't have 30 years to put into this, you know, to see if we can make something. But by the last day, one of the managers were there. They were doing like a panel conversation. And this guy said, you know, in most farms, there's like $3 million worth of investment and maybe 2 people. And on our farm, and he was like, we have $10,000 worth of equipment. It's totally not true. Let's say $10 million of equipment. They have a lot. They have their own processing facility. They have a lot of stuff. But they now have 169 full-time employees.
Wow.
They've taken a blip on the highway on a rural nowhere, Georgia, right? Not near Atlanta, not near Tallahassee. A town that just through commodity agriculture had been rendered completely insignificant, right? It's just a place where you just load semis and they leave. And now they're talking about opening a school. You know, they have like people and vitality and a cafe and people coming from all over the world to visit and cabins and
Could be the resurrection of the small towns.
completely.
Right?
It is.
Yeah.
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 The name of the farm is White Oak Pastures, and Will Harris. They're all over social media and things. Yeah. So right, I mean, you could order from them, you know, right now a steak and a wallet, and literally, like, I mean, they make everything, tallow candle, or you know, and it would arrive. But yeah,
Yeah, that's interesting to know that it's like, oh, maybe
totally.
maybe some help. We can talk about hog confinements, we can talk about privilege, and then also it was kind of the bigger, better, or family farm dichotomy. So which subjects do we want to touch on in the next 10 minutes?
Well, I think just along those lines still, you know, one of the things that hit me as I've been talking about the book and sharing these stories and after we went there is this whole concept of regenerative agriculture. And if you haven't heard this term, it's the term now. You know, Unilever's regenerative, and we're regenerative, and you know, everything in between. And it basically means, you know, at its very basic level, I would say it should mean like do no harm, right? And then we could go all the way to the other perspective of like, we're actually trying to regenerate the landscape, bring back native plants, but in that regenerative concept is generations, right? We need generations of humans that are going to be taking care of this land. And it feels like it's just as important as planting oak trees, right? Because as soon as we're dead, if somebody just plows those under, like I literally don't know if our carbon offset or it would have impacted anything. So for us, and it's one of the things in the book I probably talk most about, you know, which is interwoven with this concept of privilege. We're there, and I'm very aware that we're there because we have the privilege of access to the land. John's great-great-grandfather came to Iowa in 1851. It was the last treaty with Native groups in Iowa. There was a Black Exclusionary Act that was on the books in Iowa in 1851 that said that if you were free Black or mulatto, you needed to leave the state within 3 days, right? So it's not like just, you know, it's not accidental that now we've gotten to be fifth generation, like he got that land then. The USDA programs were there to support, you know, even in the 80s, you know, he made it through. There's a lot of farmers who didn't. But, you know, in part, it's like there was privilege. He knew the right people. The bank gave him a loan. So where are we today, right? So we have land, and there's lots of people. I do these talks all over Iowa. Mostly a lot of women come to me after. I inherited land. I don't know what to do with this land. I would love to have someone who's doing sustainable agriculture on the land. How do I do that? So, you know, there's just things from like basic writing leases that enforce there's going to be cover crops on this land. And if you don't like that land, you know, renter guy, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to get somebody else, right? That's your right as a landowner. But, you know, then there's a lot of farm trusts that are going on, and concepts like we just went and visited the Meskwaki tribe to talk about land back, like this idea of if we can't find anybody, you know, if our kids don't want to farm, so how is that going to happen, that it's going to be taken care of? And so we're talking with them about the feasibility. We're not that close to them. And so, you know, so I have a lot to learn in this realm. But I would just really, encourage us all to be thinking about this down the road, because if we don't want our food to just be done like by robots and just be, what's really the diet of much of this country is, bread, it's bad bread, some processed foods. If we don't want that path, and we can choose if we want that path or not, we have to find people to take care of this. We have to be able to give access and nurture other generations back into the land.
I agree. We've still got about 5 more minutes. Are some of you SDSU students, ag students? Okay. Are you? That's what I was just wondering. Do you talk about this in your classes?
A little bit,
Yeah. And educating the youth is college, but how young can we go?
Yeah.
'Cause I feel like
Yeah. Well,
can't go
we're
too
trying to
young, right?
work now, like with FFA and 4-H, and like have people visit. And I know there's a lot of different things. I mean, I think there's a lot out there for young people in FFA to like learn how the conventional world works. But like we were sitting there at the Iowa State Fair watching the cattle, and I thought they should have a division that's grass finish, right? So then people can start seeing like, what does that look like? Oh, this is a good body type for finishing on pasture instead of this huge Angus, cow that will never finish on your grass. But it's just there'd be really interesting ways that you could be educating people in those, where kids could be showing them, right, and learning how to take care of them that way.
when you were growing up in Bergen County, New Jersey, where did you think your state came from? Did you think about it?
Probably not
you?
at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
No, I drove through the Burger King
Yeah.
drive-through.
Yeah. And that's what a lot of it is, and that's, I think, the biggest challenge is just getting people's minds to open up to really think about where does food actually come from?
Yeah.
And why don't we want it to be all processed?
Yeah, and I mean, there's just amazing work being done on this front of like what the nutritional value of the foods that as we've bred for yield, as we've pushed that to just be higher and higher yields, our nutritional values of things in wheat and corn, all this is just plummeted. Like there's fascinating work.
And I am a little bit off the subject, but something I've always been a little curious about is you think about, okay, our population is just keeps growing, so how are we going to feed everyone? And that's the other argument of a lot of the modified foods is, but how do we feed everyone?
Yeah, I mean, in the
That's a
paper here yesterday, it was all about Bill Gates, said that we should, we need technology. I just think the emphasis on all of that. I would never say like, oh, we should not have that. I just think we just need opportunities for farmers to grow different things, to look out and say, okay, everyone is growing corn. The weather's been this, the predictions are for that. I'm gonna try, something else. But there's not, even down to your USDA office, you don't get to choose.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, this year's your corn year. Okay, that's what I'm doing then. And it's just not market driven at all.
And
It would be nice to at least have, if we're going to have capitalism, maybe let's have it so that, people could be choosing what they grow based on what the market wants. Maybe the market does want corn. Like I said, I would never say we shouldn't do any of that. But what about at the same time having gardening, like all, exposing, having seeds in different countries or different kinds of ways of growing that are more efficient with water, growing vegetables, things that don't just fill bodies, but they actually nourish and nurture.
Yes. Well, thank you, Beth. I think, I think the pandemic kind of put climate change on the back burner a little bit, but it's definitely come to the front, and it's something that needs to be addressed. And I think this is a beautiful introduction to people's minds of looking at it in a way that, like, we need to step forward and
Thank
do
you.
something. So,
Thank you.
Thank you, Beth.
All right. Thank you all.